Hey everybody, how are you? Hey, awesome. All right, so this is a brief history of physical security as told by me, Schuyler Towne. I'm really easy to Google. @Shoebox is me on Twitter. Last night, as I was finishing up my slide deck, I decided that what I was doing, every slide that I was putting together, was mostly just a punctuation for some interesting thought or like a sort of half joke. But what I actually want to do is tell you the story of the history of physical security, and so that's what I'm going to do instead. So I'm going to work without a net, and that's my only slide. I just want to tell you the story of everything that I know about locks in as brief a period of time as I possibly can. So please forgive me if I go off on tangents. I promise you every one of them is going to relate to the central topic, and I have a lot to say about this. Feel free to ask me questions, but do it when I'm in an obvious lull and I desperately need some help from the audience because I've gone completely off track and I could really use a question. That's when I want them, or at the end of the talk. Whoever it is that's doing timing for me, if you could give me a heads up at like 15 minutes to go, that would be really awesome so I can get some stuff out and still leave enough time for a couple of questions. Hello. I'm Schuyler Towne. I am obsessed with locks. I was a competitive lockpicker for a number of years, but then I won my awards. I got my black badge at DEF CON. I won the main event the next year. I beat the #2 lockpicker in the world head-to-head in Holland and had some amazing experiences doing all of those things. I began to realize that what I could do was start to learn the electrical engineering, you know what? It's my only slide. I'm not going to deal with this. @Shoebox. It's a noun. Remember it. Let's go. We can turn the projector off. I'm going to keep walking in front of it anyway, if that's okay. I realized that what I could do was start learning the electrical engineering and the software stuff that I would need to know in order to keep up with everything that's about to happen in physical security. And as exciting as everything that's about to happen in physical security is, it isn't my bag. That's not the stuff that excites me. The smell of brass and grease is invigorating to me. The heat sink in my video card is broken, and it keeps getting the locks on the table very hot. And I swear to God, there is nothing that is of a greater comfort to me than warm brass. And I just feel whole, you know? This is the stuff that I'm obsessed with. And so I was at a crossroads. In order to remain relevant in the competitive picking and in the disclosures that I had been involved with, I did disclosures with Medico, Avis, a couple of other people. These were other people's works that I helped facilitate the disclosures for. In order to remain relevant, I could start learning all of these new things, or I could go back and I could learn everything that I had never been taught, everything that I had never seen about the history of the lock and the history of lock picking and why locks exist whatsoever. So, to take this back all the way, we're going to go back to Egypt/Mesopotamia. I'll explain why Mesopotamia in a bit, but many of you may have heard of the Egyptian lock. The pin tumbler lock that's on everybody's door, it's based on this Egyptian lock, and it's called the Egyptian lock in a lot of literature. And if you go back through and you look at everything in the literature, for the past 200 years we've been calling it the Egyptian lock. I'll explain why that is incorrect a little bit later in the talk. But that's 4,000 years ago. We already have the early versions of a pin tumbler lock. Now early on we're using locks in a very different way than we're using them today. Today we'll lock our door and then we'll wander out of our house, and it's a single factor of authentication. And it's a little bit terrible, the locks that we have on our doors. Back then, the first locks you were finding on granaries and storehouses and things like that, semi-communal or potentially state property of a small society. Specific individuals would have keyed access to that, the rest of the community would not, and access and goods would be dispersed by those key holders. Then you start to see some locks get more personalized. You have locks on the chamber of the king, you have locks on the residence areas of castles. And then very quickly they find out that if the same guy that lets people into your castle is the guy that holds the key, a lot of people are going to get assassinated. So they separate the jobs out. The Rob Sakate, the lock master, is the first form of two-factor authentication in the ancient world, and this was happening many thousands of years ago. Now you have a human, a guard, that will deal with all of the personal people moving in and out and authorize an individual, but the lockmaster just carries around the pins of the lock. And when it's time to lock a door, he inserts the pins in the lock, locks the door, and walks off with the key. So if you want to get through that, you need to not only bribe the personal guy, but you need to find the lockmaster and murder him and take the key from him to get in as well. And assassination ceased in the kingdom that invented that method of two-factor authentication. It was great. We've had layered security for a lot longer than you guys have. So, unfortunately, we forgot about it. Let's skip forward quite a bit, because at some point in time, most of the developing world, as all of that area falls into tumult and discord, and now Europe is blossoming, and Asia is blossoming, and so on and so forth, the idea of the pin tumbler lock disappears from a lot of cultures. And the ones that are advancing more and more and more are using really terrible locks, warded locks. If you've ever seen a beautiful, intricate Victorian skeleton key, a lot of those are misnomers, but the idea is simple. Whatever the pattern that you're looking at looks like, the negative image of that is reproduced in metal inside of the lock. The only security is that the shape of the key corresponds to the negative image shape inside of the lock, and as long as you put something in there that avoids all of those bits of metal inside, you can open it. And this goes on for thousands of years. Everything sucks for a very long time. It's 1770 before everything stops sucking, and it stops sucking really rapidly. So, around 1770, in fact, about 20 years before this in France, but unfortunately we don't have the name of the guy that did it in France, the lever lock is invented. Now, this is a very early example of a lever lock, and it almost kind of looks like an old, crappy warded lock. To be perfectly honest, it's kind of a crappy version of a lever lock, but it was one of the earliest. This one specifically was not one of the earliest, but it's a great example of the type. And it is probably about 200 years old, so don't wander off with it, because I like it a lot. I like old stuff. All right, so what you're going to look at, there's a little peg there and some notches. And when the key moves, I know I'm showing just him, but pay attention and you'll be able to figure it out when you look at it. When the key moves through there and pushes that spring, it pushes the notch up, and then we move the bar, and the bar goes through another notch there. It's those notches. This is the simplest idea in the world, but it took us thousands of years to come up with it. Thousands of years of making locks. It's no shock that the French came up with it, because the French in the early 1700s and the late 1600s start making beautiful locks and ever more elaborate metalwork. And so there's an image in a catalog, in an old French locksmithing catalog, of this idea of a lock about 20 years before we see Baron either independently discover it or reintroduce it in England. So Baron is credited as the father of the lever lock. And that idea of having something that is active, something that is on a spring, something that has to move from one position to another set position, little notch to another little notch, that is the birth of modern physical security, and it's amazing and invigorating, and it is going to catch on fire, because now the next guy comes along and he says, oh, that's awesome. What if I add another lever to that? Now we got 2 levers in there. That's even crazier. And then somebody says, wait a minute, what if instead of just lifting the lever up, sliding it over, and dropping it into another notch, we encompass that notch completely so that if you lift the lever too high, you can't move it. And so now there's discrete heights to these levers, and the guy that did the 2 levers, he's like, oh, now my 2 levers are even crazier, because they can be different heights. And so now we have notched keys that lift the 2 levers to different heights on the 2 notches of the key. And these seem like such basic ideas now, but this was incredible stuff. This was being presented to the Royal Society in England, who were giving out grants to people that were coming up with amazing locks, with the important caveat that they weren't allowed to patent them. If they funded the development of their lock with money from the Royal Institute, they weren't allowed to get a patent. They had to release that information in a report from the Royal Institute for everyone to get use of. It's an early idea of the open source movement. If we're going to give you this money, everybody gets to benefit from your ideas. Exciting. Patent locks, however, end up becoming the sort of passphrase for this is good. This is Brahma's patent lock, or Chubb's patent lock. And the guys that can develop their locks independently end up getting patents for all sorts of things. Chubb brings the lever lock to what some people call its logical conclusion. He builds a detector. Now, he's got several levers in there. If you lift them too high, the lock won't open. If they're lifted too low, the lock won't open. And his tolerances are getting better and better than Barron ever could have hoped for. This is about 1810-ish that this is going on. His lock ends up winning a prize because the idea of detectors were out there, and what the British government wanted was a lock where not only would it defend your property, but you would be alerted to the fact that somebody had attempted to open it. So the way Chubb's lock worked was that if you overlifted that lever, rather than just not opening, it would fire a dead latch. And now you couldn't move any of the levers whatsoever. And he built his non-destructively. His wasn't the first idea of a detector mechanism, but previously, once that thing engaged, you'd have to rip the thing apart, drill it out, bash it out, hammer it out, whatever, and install a new lock. But with Chubb's, you just turned the user key in the opposite direction to reset everything, and you knew that it had been picked, but you were able to go ahead and keep using your lock anyway. It's a great lock. That was around 1810. Now, the lever lock is a phenomenal story of interesting invention and collaboration and rapid evolution over the course of a couple of decades. They're still in use today. They're still in use all over the place. We don't see them in America as much anymore. Where you primarily see them here are in safe deposit boxes. Those flat steel keys are actually operating a series of levers inside of the lock, and that's where we primarily see them in America, but they're still in very common use over in the UK and in other parts of Europe. You can go into the hardware store and buy a lever lock still to this day. They're good locks. It's a great locking concept, and it's one of the primary locking concepts. But all of that's very exciting, except that there's this guy named Brahma, who around 1777, seeing some of these lever locks coming out, seeing some of the presentations at the Royal Society, looks at the concept of the lever lock and says, it's pretty cool. Here's a bunch of ways to fix it, a bunch of ways to make it more secure. You guys enjoy. But he didn't fix it himself. Instead, he had an even crazier lock that was generations ahead of its time, that seems to have been just pulled out of nowhere, out of whole cloth. He came up with this concept of his safety lock. Now, it's fairly simple. We have a slider. The slider has a big notch taken out of it, and when you push down on the slider to the right degree, that notch aligns to a piece of metal inside of the lock, and it can slide along that piece of metal. So it's just a big notch and a track that it has to run along. That's the whole idea. Now you add a few other sliders, and their notches are at different levels, and your cuts and your key are at different heights. And when you push that key in, all of the notches line up around the track, and the whole thing can spin freely. But this is mind-bending. I mean, we were talking about just a little notch going from one direction to the other with that lever lock that's being passed around, and then slight iterations, et cetera, et cetera. This was sea change, and when he came out with this, he was the first lock maker who could honestly say, who in thousands of years could honestly say, though I have created this, I give it to you and I cannot open it. If you buy one, and you buy one, and you buy one, go ahead, inspect your own locks, rip them apart, look at them, understand how they work perfectly, and you won't be able to open each other's. And when he was doing this, it was also sea change over in France. A little while after this, and the Brahma lock is on the market now and is offering unbefore-seen security, the death of the wafer lock comes along, or at least it should have been the death of the warded lock. I meant not the wafer, the warded lock. The problem is you can still buy warded locks at Home Depot right now. Master Lock makes them, and they make plenty of money making them, and they're terrible, and they've been terrible for thousands of years, but I digress. Don't ask me a question. I still have more. Okay, so Louis XVI was an avid locksmith. Louis XVI was also beheaded. Louis XVI made warded locks explicitly. They were all spring latch warded locks of one type or another. Some of them were intricate and beautiful. Some of them were very interesting, but the fact is they were this technology that once you understood how it worked, you could wander in and open it without a key without any trouble. As it turned out, the master locksmith Gamain, to whom Louis felt like a brother, who had taught him in his workshop, Gamain was said to be the only man who was master of Louis. Louis was master of the world, and he was the only man that was master of Louis. Turned out that guy was a Jacobite, and those were the guys that were doing the beheading, which turns out terribly for Louis, because at one of the Jacobite councils, Gawain comes in and he says, "Oh yeah, that Louis guy, he's such a jerk. Here's how his secret stash safe works. Enjoy." And they gathered several treasonous documents from the Armoire d'Affaires that Gawain and Louis had built together. Gawain didn't go with them. He didn't open that lock himself. He just described to the council how the lock worked. And because it was a warded lock, they were able to wander in, open the thing up, and grab piles of treasonous documents. Now he would have been beheaded regardless. But it was a big story, and Gawain was seen as a villain in all of the other kingdoms. There's a lot of great stuff written about him in England, about what a scumbag he was, because they still had a monarchy and they were really down with it. So they didn't like seeing Louis lose his head. But this was a warded lock, and the lock was talked about a lot. The fact that the locksmith sold him out was talked about a lot. And here we have Brahma, who's able to say, if you are my king, I can give you this lock and not reveal its secrets for anybody. It was an enormous step forward in security. Okay, so that was around 1777. Somebody does manage to pick Brahma's lock, but that's not a big deal because he fixes it and nobody ever picks it again until 1851, but we're getting there. And Brahma also holds public contests, which is very important. Not only did he add to the greater physical security of the world as a whole, but he also was one of the first people to introduce the idea of a public picking contest against his lock. And he just left it in the window, and anybody could take like 30 days to attempt to pick his lock. And if you failed, nothing wrong. You just returned the lock. If you were successful, you got a pile of cash. So around 1788, 1789, Napoleon, still in France has a lot to do with this, decides to invade Egypt. This goes really poorly for him, but he does something very interesting in the process. He decides to carry out just this mass cultural looting. And so his soldiers bring with them the corps of savants, a bunch of artists, archaeologists, linguists, mathematicians, philosophers, etc., etc. This was, I think, almost 200 people, maybe 170. Don't quote me on that. I got a lot of stuff right, but this one I'm guessing at. To go with him and observe everything and gather anything of potential cultural value with them as they left. In histories of this, they have genuinely been described as worse than the Nazis with their cultural looting. Vivant Denon, the gentleman we're about to talk about, has been described as making Goring look like an amateur for the level of cultural looting that he carried out by Napoleon's side throughout Europe, including Egypt. Now the big question is, why don't France have all of these artifacts that they took? Well, this went so poorly for them that they ended up being blockaded by the British when they were trying to retreat. And the deal that was worked out was that the French gave the British a large collection of the cultural artifacts that they had looted, and the British turned a blind eye while the French sailed back to France. And now we have the Rosetta Stone in British museums and so on and so forth. All of those things came from that campaign. So Denon was particularly interesting in that, when given the opportunity, he separated from the corps of savants to go into an area of Egypt that no educated European had spent time in. There was a man named Murad Bey who was a guerrilla cavalryman, which sounds terrifying, like a gorilla riding on a horse. But it was the other type of guerrilla, and there were horses, though. There were horses. There's only one type of cavalry as far as I know. Anyway, so he's chasing after Murad Bey, Vivant is, in connection with a small band of the military. And Murad is leading them deeper and deeper into Upper Egypt. In Upper Egypt, there hasn't been any trade there. There's a lot of old, ancient ruins and tribal societies and so on and so forth. And as he's going through, Vivant is discovering things that no one has seen in millennia. And he comes across the temple at Karnak, and he looks at a carving on the wall. And apparently it was so blisteringly hot at Karnak that he couldn't take time to sit and draw what he observed. Now, he was a phenomenal artist. He was actually a relatively popular pornographer and a great etcher as well. So he has all of these amazing diagrams from his time, but not this wall that he was looking at. And on this wall that he was looking at, he saw a lock. He saw a lock that he was seeing all around him in Egypt, and that a few people had seen on doors in Turkey. And it was the pin tumbler lock. And he realized that this lock on the wall was the exact same as the lock that he was seeing in this modern culture. And this, understandably, blew his mind. Now, Vivant was a phenomenal writer. As vitriolic as he was powerful in his wonderment, about the pyramids, he said, "It is hard to decide what is more astonishing, the tyrannical dementia that dared order their building or the stupid obedience of the people who agreed to help build them." He didn't mince words. About the lock, however, it was just this almost childlike wonderment. He marveled that this simple utilitarian invention was transmitted by tradition throughout all the revolutions of nations. That this lock, despite everything else that had happened, despite the actual physical ruination that he witnessed around him of an enormous culture, that this lock had survived into common modern use in the area that he was in. Now, Vivant wrote all of this down, and an English guy translated it a year or two later, and they were released around 1801, 1802. And as these volumes end up in the English-speaking parts of the world, first of all, it completely changed, it created this phenomenal surge of Egyptian dress and Egyptian art, and it was like this amazing new fad that grew out of his journals. But in the mechanical engineering world, and which was incredibly vibrant at the time, people started obsessing about this lock, and some plates of drawings of other locks that they had seen in the region, more modern ones. And there was this general consensus of, this thing is better than what we've been using. So by 1804, we see the first patent for the Egyptian lock, which is the first patent for a modern pin tumbler lock. And now all of a sudden, pin tumbler locks are being reintroduced to the society that is in the midst. When we're talking 1801, 1804, it was 1810 before Chubb finished the idea of the detector lever lock. This was, the Brahma lock was selling like gangbusters and nobody was picking it. The Royal Society was handing out the grants, and now the pin tumbler lock is reintroduced to the world at this incredibly fertile moment and starts blowing up and starts getting made in America as well, because that guy that filed the patent in England, he also filed a patent in America. Sadly, we've lost ours to the Patent Office fire of 1836, but we have the British copy so we can see exactly what he was doing. We'll catch back up with the pin tumbler lock because that continues to get developed. But our focus right now is going to be on these lever locks and Brahma's slider safety lock. This fertile time at some point catches the imagination of the media. And the media are going to be very excited about this for decades and decades and decades. Over in America, we're a little bit gung-ho about the idea of picking locks to prove that your lock is better. And a guy named Hobbs, Charles Alfred Hobbs, is going around to banks pitching his paratoptic lock that he's developed with the Day and Newell Company. Paratoptic is derived from a Greek word talking about hidden. There's a hidden element in the lock, and that was its security. To prove that their lock is more secure, he goes around to banks and says, hey, if I can pick your lock, you got to buy mine. And a lot of them said yes. For whatever reason, a lot of them were like, get out of here, idiot, you can't pick our lock. And he did it. He did it over and over and over and over again. Now, while he's doing this, it's getting towards the mid-1800s. You know, he's making his name in the 1840s, picking locks like mad, selling, doing great things for the Day and Newell Company. Coming up is the Great Exhibition of 1851, where England is inviting nations from all over the world to come and present the best of their engineering, their craftsmanship, their art, and so on and so forth. So Hobbs and the Day and Newell Company intend to get him the hell over there with his crazy lock and mix things up in England a little bit and show them how we do it in America. But over in England, in the meanwhile, the Brahma lock hasn't been picked in 70 years. And the Chubb lock hasn't been picked in 40 years. And we're talking about generations of people. 4 generations of people, for the Brahma lock, who genuinely believe that the security arms race is over. They believe in the idea of perfect security. And over 4 generations, in the midst of a new paradigm, you start using things differently. And locks are being left alone to do their job by themselves now. Normal people have locks much more often. There are locks on cabinets, there are locks on doors, there are locks in all sorts of places that there were locks on doors before, but people that wouldn't have had locks on their doors now have locks on doors. And because everybody is making them, the market, the prices are just crashing, and people are able to get really decent locks for really cheap money, which has never happened before. And so they're using them in brand new ways, and in very personal ways. In the same personal ways that we use them now, only back then, they genuinely believed in their heart of hearts that when they locked something and wandered away from it, there was no way to open it. And while we know better, we tell ourselves some lies that we'll get to in a little bit. Back then, they didn't have to lie to themselves. What they believed was true for a good amount of time. So because of this notion of perfect security, because Brahma has had this lock in their window for generations, and the only attempts to open it have failed. Guy took 2 weeks attempting to open it and failed completely. Now in America we have these contests, and the ingenuity over there is amazing. The number of people filing patents in America for locks is skyrocketing. The lock boom in America is significant enough that more than one clockworks in Connecticut walked outside, knocked the C off their building, and became lockworks. And I am not simplifying it, that's actually what they did. Connecticut was producing more locks for over a decade than all of the rest of our nation combined. There was an enormous boom happening in this industry. And that was changing the face of the industry too, which is going to have some fallout after the exhibition, which we'll talk about. So in America, we're so excited. The people filing patents, some of these people are real goofballs. Henry Robinson Towne wrote this blistering treatise on the construction of locks and safes. And I say blistering because more than once he peppers it with things like, stop patenting your crappy locks, you don't know what you're doing, amateurs, get out of my house. He was so much more eloquent than I am. That is not what he said, but it was very similar. He basically said, for some reason, every person that considers themselves an inventor today is compelled to invent a lock. And they were inventing a lot of the same problems that had already been solved into them. Patent diving back into this time to look at the locks is incredible. Amazing ideas, most of them horrible, but just the variety is incredible. So this is what's going on in America. Over in England, however, they're refining their same concepts. They're iterating, they're not creating as much new. There's some interesting things going on, but the stuff that's capturing the imagination of the market, that's capturing the imagination of popular media. I mean, Brahma's locks are written about in so many plays and books, talking about, oh, he removed the Brahma lock from his key and knocked the dust out of it, because they apparently used to get a lot of lint in the key because of the way that it was shaped. Hell, Brahma's key was the smallest key anyone had seen up until that point of time. You could actually carry a pile of keys around without ripping your pants apart, without looking like a madman. In antiquity, the keys were so big that you would sling them over your shoulder and wander through the town. The key to the city is a very old concept. Athens gave a key to Athena because even though her name was the name of the town, it was that key that proved that she had dominion over the town. Brahma's was small, it was discreet, it was handy, it was reproducible, it was mass-produced. So he is very popular. Chubb is very popular. There are other makers that are very popular, especially the ones that are able to take these iterated ideas and start producing them less expensively and really get the locks all out there. But it's not the same sort of competitive, very in-your-face ingenuity that's happening in America. And these two cultures are about to clash hard. Just before he leaves for England, Hobbes is given the challenge of opening the vault at the Mercantile Exchange or maybe just the Merchants Exchange in New York. Now, they opened this up to everybody that wanted to try it. But Brahma's locks, Chubb's locks, the very idea of perfect security has really permeated the English-speaking world. And so they're giving everybody 30 days to test against this lock. Hobbes rolled in and did it in an hour. He was changing the game. He was changing the world at that moment. But England didn't know about it yet. They'd find out in a couple of months. So, he goes over to England. The Great Exhibition is also this amazing coming out party for America as far as the European world is concerned. And by extension, the rest of the English-speaking world. The sun at that time was yet to set on the British Empire, so America got a big reputation boost out of the Great Exhibition because when we showed up, the press was not kind to us. The Times of London said about the American exhibition, "If they do excite a smile, it is by their pretensions. When they do come out of their own province of rugged industrialism to attempt competition with European elegance, they do make themselves ridiculous." We were the bumpkins of the competitions. There were a bunch of competitions throughout the thing. There were reaping machines and plows and yachts, and we won all of them. I usually like to talk about all these things, but I have a lot more to cover because we're covering a lot of the history today. But let me say this about the yachts. The reason that the America's Cup is called the America's Cup is not because it has anything to do with the Americas, but because in 1851, a yacht from America named the America showed up in England. They said, "Oh, let's make this annual yacht race an international." It was 51 British yachts and the America. No other nation participated. 43-mile course, and we beat them by 7 miles. Yeah! As we passed the finish line, the captain slowed the ship down, lowered the flags, and had all of his men come out on deck and lower their hats because they were passing the Queen's barge. This was described the next day in the papers as though a jockey had stopped before the finish line to wave at the crowd. He was just running up the score on them. So they finally crossed the finish line. There's some guy with a private militia that has them all firing off their guns in celebration. The British loved it. They thought that this was incredible. The Queen, probably apocryphally, but the story was told for generations after this, the Queen turns to somebody and says, "Who was first?" And the person replies, "America." She says, "Who was second?" And they reply, "No one," because everyone else was still running the race for a lot longer. So, again, this was our, thank you very much. So this was the big coming out party for America. Our reaping machines were the best reaping machines they ever saw. They bought American guns for the British military. Rubber. Goodyear was over there with his India rubber globes with no idea of what they might become someday. Morse with the telegraph. And this yacht. And this yacht really captured the imagination of a lot of people because the yachting community is a good mix of the highbrow and real hard engineering types. So, when Hobbes rolled in and opened all of their locks, the press had already changed about us a lot. We weren't treated as pleasant idiots that looked ridiculous when we tried to compete with them because we were beating the pants off of them. Instead, we were being treated with a lot of respect in the media. But when Hobbes rolled in, and on the show floor, on his first day, somebody asked him to pick a Chubb lock, and he did. That's 40 years, gone in a whim. Thank you. It was devastating. Chubb protested. They set up a real trial where he actually went and in front of a jury opened a Chubb lock in very short order, less than an hour, installed in a private vault in London. Chubb will continue to protest for a decade after this, a little bit shaming himself. In fact, the British press will take Chubb to task for not just admitting that he was beat. Brahma, on the other hand, Brahma agrees to the trial against their lock. They've offered it to the public. Even though this guy's already starting to make a name for himself over here, he has every right to try to pick their lock. So they set the lock in a block for him, and he's given 30 days to test against it, just like anybody else would get. 30 days. Today, the longest you can get a test against the lock is 2 sessions of 15 minutes. And if it passes, that is a high security pick-resistant cylinder. That's the best, and that's only in Japan. We don't do anything like that here. 30 days, that is the entire idea of perfect security. That is the manifestation of this 4-generation belief that the arms race was over. Give this guy 30 days. We have nothing to worry about. It is impossible. And honestly, it took him 52 hours over 14 days. That is an amazing lock. It is still sold today, and they even improved it after he opened it to defeat some of what he was doing. It's a beautiful lock. It's pickable, but it's a beautiful lock. The way that he got it open was practically brute forcing. It wasn't even amazing technique. He's just very smart, and he built the tools out over the course of that 52 hours to make sure he could open this one lock consistently. And he got that prize, and he changed British culture, and he changed physical security forever. And at first it seemed like it was going to be amazing. At first it seemed like he had broken the heart of the British people. The next day in the papers, lovely quote, heartbreaking quote. Before the exhibition opened, we believed we had the best locks in the world. And among us, Brahma and Chubb were considered quite as impregnable as Gibraltar. More so, for the key to the Mediterranean was taken by us. We have passed the years quietly in this belief. And it seems cruel at this time of day when men have been taught to. Our American cousins have given us a filial lesson in ingenuity, in innovation. We have become lazy. It is time. A friend that everyone knows about. So let's stop it. Let's cut it out. I don't know. I have no solution. I have no solution. I'm just an academic trying to get everybody as riled up as I am. Anyone else? Don't forget your vows. Thank you all again so much. Come pick some locks with me. Thank you.